Moses dies in the 34th chapter of Deuteronomy. And then the book keeps going. It describes his burial. It tells you that God put him in a valley in the land of Moab, and then, in the King James wording, "No man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day." Unto this day. Somebody is writing long enough after the funeral that the location of the grave has had time to be forgotten. That single phrase is where this investigation starts, because for most of the last 2,000 years, Jews and Christians were taught that Moses wrote those 5 books himself: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The whole Torah, start to finish, in his own hand. Open a King James Bible printed in America any time in the last 300 years and you'll still see it on the page. The heading over Genesis reads, "The first book of Moses," right there in the ink. And the text itself, when you read it slowly, quietly disagrees. Not in one place, in dozens. And the man who first laid those places side by side in a printed book and drew the obvious conclusion out loud was a lens grinder in Amsterdam named Baruch Spinoza in a book published in the year 1670, almost 200 years before anything we'd recognize as modern biblical scholarship existed. What makes him worth your time here isn't the scandal, it's the method. Spinoza's argument was that a sacred text has to be studied the way you'd study anything else in the world, by asking who was speaking, in what language, to what audience, under what circumstances, and what those words meant to the people who first heard them. Not what you need them to mean, what they meant. And here's the part that surprises people. 3.5 centuries later, working from manuscripts he never saw and archaeology that didn't exist yet, historians and textual scholars have confirmed a large portion of what he noticed just by reading carefully. So that's the trail we're walking today. The seams in the Torah that anyone can see once they're pointed out. The method that turned noticing into a discipline. The evidence from Qumran and from silver amulets and from a scroll found in a temple in the year 622 BCE. Where scholars strongly agree, where they argue hard with each other, and what happens to your relationship with the text when you stop needing it to be something it never claimed to be. If you grew up sitting in a wooden pew on Sunday mornings, hymnal in the rack in front of you, this is going to land in a very specific place. Stay with it. And if this channel is new to you, subscribing and hitting like genuinely decides whether investigations like this one reach anybody at all. That's the whole ask. Let's keep going. Start with what's actually sitting in the text, because you don't need a degree in ancient languages to see it. You need patience and a willingness to read what's on the page instead of what you were told is on the page. Genesis chapter 36 is a list of Edomite kings. Edom was the kingdom just south and east of Israel, and the chapter introduces the list this way in the King James. These are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom, before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. Before there reigned any king over Israel. That sentence only makes sense coming from someone who lives after Israel has kings. Saul, the first one, comes along roughly 3 centuries after the traditional dating of Moses. You don't write before there were kings in Israel unless there are, by now, kings in Israel. Genesis chapter 12, Abraham walking through the land, and the narrator drops in a small aside, and the Canaanite was then in the land. Then. Meaning not now. Meaning the writer is looking back from a time when Canaanites are no longer the people in charge of that territory. All through Deuteronomy, the writer describes places as being beyond the Jordan, and the geography only works if the writer is standing on the western side, in the land. While Moses, in the story, dies on the eastern side and never crosses over. And then there's the simple matter of voice. Moses is talked about constantly in the third person. Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, tells you that Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. Read that again as autobiography and see how it sounds. Now, Spinoza was not the first person in history to notice these. And this matters, because the story is often told as though a heretic invented the problem. He didn't. He inherited it. 500 years earlier, a Spanish Jewish commentator named Abraham ibn Ezra, who lived in the 1100s and is still printed in the margins of traditional rabbinic Bibles today, wrote a famously cryptic note on the opening of Deuteronomy. He listed a handful of passages: the Canaanite verse, the Edomite kings, the mountain of God, a few others, and said, essentially, that whoever understands the secret here should keep silent. He wouldn't spell it out. He just left a trail of breadcrumbs for careful readers and moved on. Spinoza picked up those breadcrumbs and said the thing out loud. That's an important distinction to hold on to for the whole video, because it's the difference between a conspiracy and a history. Nobody was hiding these verses. They were sitting in the text the entire time, in every synagogue and every church, read aloud on schedule, printed in every edition. Ibn Ezra saw them in the 12th century. Rabbis debated Moses writing the account of his own death in the Talmud centuries before that. The information was never locked away. What changed over time was the teaching. And a simplified teaching isn't a lie. It's what happens when a complicated tradition has to be handed to 8-year-olds in a Sunday school classroom with construction paper and a felt board. Simplify it long enough, across enough generations, and the simplification becomes the thing people think they're defending. So what did Spinoza actually propose? Because the seams were old news. The method was not. His book is the Theological-Political Treatise. In his day, it circulated under its Latin title, and the word treatise just means an extended argument on a single subject. It came out in 1670. And it came out scared. The title page says it was printed in Hamburg by a publisher named Henricus Qumran. It wasn't. It was printed in Amsterdam, and Qumran had been dead since 1605. A fake city, a fake printer, no author's name anywhere on it. 4 years later, the states of Holland banned it outright. That's not a martyr story. It's a data point about temperature. It tells you how volatile this kind of reading felt in the 1600s, in a Dutch republic that was, by the standards of its century, unusually tolerant. The core of the argument sits in Chapter 7, and it's disarmingly simple. Spinoza's rule, in plain modern English, is that the meaning of Scripture has to be drawn out of Scripture itself. The same way knowledge of the natural world has to be drawn out of the natural world itself. You don't decide in advance what the text must be saying because your theology requires it, and then bend the words to fit. You go the other direction. You gather the whole of what a text says, catalog its language, its contradictions, its repetitions, its historical references. You ask what Hebrew idioms meant in their own time. You ask what happened to the book between the moment it was written and the moment it reached your hands. And critically, he separates 2 questions people jam together. What does this text mean? And is this text true? Spinoza insisted you have to settle the first one honestly before you're allowed anywhere near the second. Because if you let the answer you wanted the second question steer the first, you're not reading, you're rehearsing. That sounds obvious now. It was radical then, and here's why. It treats a sacred book as an object with a history. A thing that was written by somebody, somewhere, in a specific century, for a specific audience with specific problems, in a language that shifted over time. You already do this instinctively with other documents. When you read a letter your grandmother wrote in 1943, you read it knowing what was happening in 1943. You don't strip the war out of it. You'd lose the letter if you did. Spinoza's claim was that the Torah deserves at least that much attention. And in Chapter 8 of that same treatise, he took his own method for a test drive on the Pentateuch. The word simply means 5 books, the Greek term for the Torah. He walked through the verses we just looked at, added a stack more, and concluded that these 5 books were not written by Moses, but compiled long afterward by a later hand, working from older material. His best guess for the compiler was Ezra, the scribe who leads the return from Babylonian exile in the 5th century BCE. Modern scholarship doesn't land exactly where he landed, but it lands in the same country. And it got there by doing what he said to do, reading the text on its own terms, all the way down, and refusing to look away from the parts that don't fit. Here's where the trail gets genuinely strange, in the good way. Once you start reading the Torah the way Spinoza suggested, as a document with a history rather than a single dictation, you notice something the seams alone don't explain. It isn't just that the text seems written later than Moses. It's that in a lot of places, the text seems to be telling you the same story twice. Genesis opens with creation. 6 days, a rhythm, a formula repeating like a liturgy. God speaking things into existence from above. Light, sky, land, plants, animals, and last of all human beings, male and female together in the divine image. Then it rests on the 7th day. The Hebrew word for God through that entire section is Elohim. And then, in the middle of chapter 2, creation starts over. Now the order is different. Now a man is formed first, out of dust, before there are plants in the field. Now God plants a garden by hand, walks in it in the cool of the day, brings animals to the man to see what he'll name them, and only then makes a woman. The tone is completely different, earthy, intimate, close to the ground. And the name for God changes. It becomes Yahweh Elohim, using the personal 4-letter Hebrew name that most English Bibles render as the Lord in small capitals. 2 accounts. Different order, different mood, different vocabulary, different divine name, back to back, with no attempt to reconcile them. Now flip forward to the flood, Genesis chapters 6 through 9, and watch the same thing happen inside a single story. In chapter 6, Noah is told to bring 2 of every kind of animal, a male and a female. In chapter 7, he's told to take 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of the unclean ones. In chapter 7, the rain falls 40 days and 40 nights. A few verses later, the waters prevail on the earth 150 days. In one strand, the flood comes from rain. In another, the fountains of the great deep burst open and the windows of heaven are opened. Cosmic waters breaking through from above and below, which is a different picture of the universe entirely. Anyone who sat through enough Sunday school knows the version they teach. 2 of each, 40 days, rainbow at the end. The version on the page is doing something more complicated. The technical name for this in the field is a doublet. 2 versions of the same material preserved side by side. And the flood is the showcase case, because the 2 strands can be pulled apart and each one reads as a complete, coherent story on its own. That's the part that stops people cold. It's not that the text is sloppy, it's that it looks braided. Sit with what that would mean for a second. If somebody were fabricating a smooth national epic from scratch, they'd smooth it. Nobody writing one document, one time, keeps both the 7 pairs and the 2. You keep both when both versions already exist, both are already loved, and you don't feel authorized to throw either one away. That's not the behavior of a forger. That's the behavior of an archivist. The single strongest clue in the whole puzzle is a verse most people have never read, and it turns on a name. Exodus chapter 6. Moses at the burning bush aftermath, and God says to him, in the King James, I appeared unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob by the name of God Almighty, but by my name Jahavash was I not known to them. Read that plainly. God is saying, the patriarchs knew me by one title, El Shaddai, God Almighty. They did not know my personal name. That's new information, revealed here, to Moses, for the first time. Now go back to Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, the very end of the Cain and Abel material. In the King James, then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. That's the 4-letter name. Generations before Abraham was born. And in between, the name shows up constantly. Abraham uses it. Jacob uses it. It's woven through the patriarchal stories. So one strand of the Torah says the name was known from almost the beginning of human history. Another strand says explicitly that it was withheld until Moses. Both are preserved. Neither is deleted. That verse is what got the modern conversation started, and it started in a place people don't expect. In 1753, a French physician named Jean Astruc, a believer, trying to defend Moses, not undermine him, published a set of conjectures arguing that Moses must have worked from 2 older written memoirs, one that used Elohim and one that used the divine name, and that you could sort Genesis into them by tracking which name appears. He thought he was solving a problem for the faithful. Then German scholars ran with it for 125 years. And in 1878, Julius Wellhausen published the synthesis that dominated the field for the next century. The idea that the Torah is a weave of 4 major sources edited together over centuries. In the shorthand every seminary student learns, they're called J, E, P, and D. J for the strand that uses the divine name from the start, with its vivid, close-up, walking in the garden God. E for the strand that prefers Elohim and tends to keep more distance. Dreams, angels, messengers. P for the priestly material, genealogies, ritual law, exact measurements, the 6-day creation with its liturgical rhythm, an enormous share of Leviticus. And D for Deuteronomy, which has its own distinct voice, sermonic, hortatory, obsessed with one single place of worship. Now, one honest note before this goes further, and it matters. That 4-source model is a reconstruction. It is not a manuscript. Nobody has ever dug up a scroll labeled J. What scholars have is the internal evidence. Names, vocabulary, theology, contradictions, style, and an inference built on top of it. Which raises exactly the right question, and it's the question a good skeptic should ask here. Is there any independent reason to believe ancient books were actually assembled this way? Or is this just modern academics finding patterns in the clouds? That question has an answer. It's a good one. We'll get there. First, the version of this that reached American living rooms, because a lot of you have already met it without knowing where it came from. In 1987, a scholar named Richard Elliott Friedman, trained at Harvard and later teaching at the University of California, San Diego and the University of Georgia, published a book called Who Wrote the Bible? It sold to a general audience, showed up in public library paperback racks all over the country, and became the way most non-specialist Americans first encountered any of this. In 2003, he followed it with The Bible with Sources Revealed, which does something almost cheeky. It prints the entire Torah in English with different typefaces, so you can see with your eyes which words he assigns to which source. Friedman's picture is a political and geographic one, and that's what makes it stick. After Solomon, the story goes, the kingdom splits in two. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Two capitals, two priesthoods, two sets of national memories, competing over the same ancestors. He reads J as coming out of the southern kingdom, Judah, with its interest in Jerusalem and the tribe of Judah. He reads E as northern, with its interest in the northern tribes and the sanctuaries up there. Then in 722 BCE, Assyria destroys the northern kingdom, and refugees flood south into Jerusalem, carrying their scrolls with them. And you end up with two rival national epics in one city, and somebody has to do something with them. Friedman argues the priestly material was composed in Jerusalem later, in the era of King Hezekiah, and that the final assembly happened around the time of Ezra after the Babylonian exile. Set that beside a detail from the Book of Kings that historians have been chewing on since 1805. In the year 622 BCE, during renovations of the Jerusalem temple under King Josiah, the high priest Hilkiah announces that he has found a scroll, the Book of the Law. It's read to the king. The king tears his clothes, because the nation has clearly not been keeping what's in it. And he launches the most sweeping religious reform in the history of Judah, centralizing all sacrifice in Jerusalem, shutting down the local shrines. In 1805, a German scholar named Wilhelm de Wet pointed out that the reforms Josiah carries out match, item for item, the demands of Deuteronomy, and specifically the demand that there be one single legitimate place of worship, which no other book in the Torah insists on that way. That connection between Josiah's scroll and Deuteronomy is one of the more durable proposals in the field. Scholars argue over whether the scroll was newly written, newly rediscovered, or an older text revised. But the link between that book and that reform is taken seriously across a very wide range of positions. And notice what that means about how a text can enter a nation's life. Not with a thunderclap, with a renovation project, a scroll, a king, and a policy change. If this is opening things up for you, hitting like is what pushes it toward the next person quietly wondering the same things. And if somebody in your life has been chewing on these questions and hasn't had anyone to talk to about them, send it their way. Now, honesty requires a hard turn here, because if this video left you thinking the four-source model is settled science, it would be doing exactly what the simplified Sunday school version does, just in the other direction. The documentary hypothesis is not a consensus. It's a contested framework, and the argument inside the field right now is loud. Through the 1970s, scholars in Germany and elsewhere began taking it apart. Rolf Rentorf and Erhard Bloom argued that the older layers aren't continuous documents at all, that Genesis and Exodus were originally separate blocks of tradition that got joined much later, and that what looks like a source is really a chain of expansions. Others proposed what's called a supplementary model. Instead of four scrolls braided together, one core text that later writers kept adding to, generation after generation, like a house with wings built onto it over 200 years. Konrad Schmid, at the University of Zurich, has written extensively about how much European scholarship moved away from the classic model, and he's argued against the recent American revival of it in print. Because there is a revival. Joel Baden at Yale and Jeffrey Stackard at the University of Chicago have made a detailed case for a streamlined version of the documentary approach, the neo-documentarians, as the field calls them, arguing that once you strip away Wellhausen's outdated assumptions about religious evolution, the basic insight still explains the contradictions better than anything else on offer. And there are scholars, including conservative ones at evangelical institutions, who reject the whole enterprise and argue for a much earlier, much more unified composition. So where does that leave you? Not nowhere. Look at what all of these camps share. Essentially no critical scholar working today, across Jewish, Christian, and secular institutions, thinks one man named Moses sat down and wrote all 5 books. What they argue about is the shape of the alternative. How many hands? How many stages? Which century? Whether the pieces were once independent documents or successive layers on a growing core. The disagreement is about the mechanism. The composite character of the text is not really where the fight is, and that distinction is worth carrying with you far beyond this topic. When you hear scholars disagree, the useful next question is always, disagree about what, exactly? Sometimes the disagreement is total. Sometimes it's four experts arguing furiously about the details of a building they all agree is standing right there. Your instinct to ask that question, to want the map of the argument and not just somebody's conclusion, that's not doubt. That's the exact habit of mind that produced all of this scholarship in the first place. Spinoza's whole contribution was refusing to let anyone hand him a finished answer before he'd looked at the evidence himself. That impulse in you is the same equipment. Back to the question that should have been nagging at you. Is there any actual, physical proof that ancient people built books this way? Out of older books, stitched, layered, preserving contradictions? Yes, and some of it is inside your own Bible. Start there, because it's the cleanest case. Open 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Those books cover the same history as Samuel and Kings, and scholars overwhelmingly agree that the chronicler had Samuel and Kings in front of him, sometimes copying nearly word for word, sometimes rewriting, sometimes cutting. 2 Samuel chapter 24 opens with God's anger against Israel and God moving David to take a census. The parallel passage in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 has Satan standing up against Israel and provoking David to number the people. Same event, different actor. A later writer, uncomfortable with what the older text said, revising it, and both versions ending up canonized, side by side, in the same Bible sitting on your shelf. That's not theory. That's an editorial process you can watch happen, with both the before and the after preserved. Then push outside the Bible entirely. In 1985, a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania named Jeffrey Tigay edited a volume called Empirical Models for Biblical Criticism, and the argument was exactly the one skeptics were demanding. Don't just theorize about how ancient editors worked, go find ancient texts where we actually have multiple stages and see what real editors really did. The centerpiece is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Mesopotamian poem about a king searching for immortality. We have it in several forms across more than 1,000 years. Sumerian poems, an Old Babylonian version, later versions, and the long standard version from Assyrian libraries. So we can lay the stages next to each other and measure the changes. And the editors did precisely the things biblical scholars had been accused of imagining. They combined once independent stories into a single frame. They inserted whole episodes from other traditions. They added prologues. They preserved older wording even when it created rough spots. They kept doublets. That's the payoff. The kind of editing the documentary hypothesis proposes is not a fantasy invented by German professors in the 1800s. It's how literature demonstrably worked in that world. And there's one more piece of the Gilgamesh material that ties directly back to Genesis. The standard version contains a flood story. A god warns one man. He builds a boat, saves his family and animals. The waters cover the earth. The boat lands on a mountain. He releases birds to test for dry land, and he offers a sacrifice the gods gather around. The relationship between that story and Noah's is debated in its details, but the family resemblance is not seriously in question. Israel was telling a flood story that circulated widely across the ancient Near East and telling it their own way, with their own God, their own moral logic, their own covenant at the end. Which is a more interesting fact than a threatening one. It means these texts were alive in a real world, in conversation with neighbors, doing something with inherited material rather than floating free of history. Now the manuscripts. Because there's a second question underneath all of this, and it's arguably the more unsettling one. Even after the Torah was assembled, was the text stable? In the spring of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard pottery break. Over the next decade, 11 caves near a site called Qumran gave up the remains of roughly 900 manuscripts, copied mostly between about the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century of the Common Era. Before that, the oldest complete Hebrew Bibles anyone had were medieval, copied around 1,000 years after the fact by scribes called the Masoretes, whose accuracy was legendary. The scrolls jumped the evidence backward by 1,000 years in one step. And the headline everyone repeats is true. The Isaiah scroll from Qumran is remarkably close to the medieval text. Scribal transmission in that stream was genuinely careful. But the fuller picture, the one specialists have spent 70 years working out, is more textured. Emanuel Tov of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who oversaw the publication of the scrolls for years, has described the collection as showing real textual variety. Sitting in those same caves are Hebrew scrolls that match the Greek Septuagint, the translation made in Egypt in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE against the medieval Hebrew. And there are scrolls that share the distinctive expanded readings of the Samaritan Pentateuch, the version of the Torah kept by the Samaritan community, which sometimes fills in gaps by repeating material from elsewhere in the text. One example scholars point to often is a Deuteronomy manuscript from Cave 4 that preserves a different arrangement of material than the traditional text. So in the last centuries before the Common Era, more than one form of the Torah was in circulation, in Hebrew, inside Jewish communities, at the same time. The standardization we inherited came later. Now go the other direction in time, to the oldest scrap of biblical text anyone has ever held. In 1979, at a site called Ketef Hinnom, in a burial chamber cut into rock just outside the old city of Jerusalem, archaeologists found 2 tiny rolled silver amulets. Unrolling them took years. Inscribed on them, in Old Hebrew script, is a version of the priestly blessing from Numbers chapter 6. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you." They're dated to around 600 BCE. The Israel Museum notes they're some 500 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. 2 things at once, and hold them together. Biblical language was already circulating in Jerusalem before the exile, worn around people's necks, not just filed in an archive. And the wording on the silver isn't identical to the wording in your Bible. Here's where this touches you directly. Pick up almost any modern study Bible in an American bookstore and look at the bottom of the page. Those small footnotes. Other ancient authorities read, "Some manuscripts add." That's this exact history, printed by the publisher, in your hands, right now. The evidence of a living, moving text has been sitting in the footnotes of your own Bible the entire time. Step back far enough and the whole shape comes into view. Not a stack of embarrassing errors. A structure. What the Torah looks like, once you've followed all of that, is a national library that somebody bound into a single scroll. Southern material and northern material. Priestly law and folk narrative. A God who walks in a garden and a God who speaks the cosmos into being from outside it. Ancient poetry that scholars date, on linguistic grounds, centuries earlier than the prose around it. All of it assembled by people who inherited more than one version of who they were and refused to throw any of it out. And the editorial philosophy behind that choice is, honestly, remarkable. They could have picked a winner. Every empire in that world was perfectly capable of erasing a rival's version. Instead, whoever did the final work kept the 7 pairs, and the 2 kept both creation accounts, kept the verse that says the name was always known, and the verse that says it was revealed to Moses. That looks less like an author and more like a community deciding that unity mattered more than tidiness. If you've ever sat through a church business meeting where 2 factions with real history between them hammered out a statement everybody could live with, you already understand the document you're holding. Compromise texts have a particular texture. They keep both phrases. They read a little rough on purpose. And this is the wider horizon, worth naming clearly. This isn't a Jewish phenomenon or a Christian one. It's what happens to every text a community loves. Early Islam faced questions of variant readings and standardization under the Caliph Uthman in the 7th century. Buddhist canons exist in multiple recensions across languages and centuries. The Christian New Testament has its own dense textual history. Every tradition that has carried words across generations has faced transmission, translation, editing, and simplification, and every one of them has a popular version that runs smoother than the scholarly one. That's not corruption. That's what happens when something gets carried by human beings for a very long time. Which brings us to the gentlest and maybe most important point in this whole investigation. Nobody hid this from you. The heading, "The First Book of Moses," on the Genesis page of a King James Bible was added by translators as a convenience, following a long tradition. It isn't part of the Hebrew text, which titles the book by its first word. Your Sunday school teacher taught what she'd been taught, sincerely, with a flannel board and a class of restless kids in 40 minutes. The pastor with 3 points and an altar call had a congregation to shepherd, not a seminar to run. Simplification travels faster than nuance in every field. Ask any physician what happens to their careful explanation by the time it reaches the family group chat. The gap between the popular version and the scholarly one isn't evidence of a plot. It's the ordinary physics of how knowledge moves through a large community over centuries, which means finding the gap doesn't require you to feel betrayed by anyone. It just means you found the older, stranger, more crowded room behind the wall. So what do you do with the room once you're standing in it? This is where Spinoza's actual proposal matters, and it's the part almost nobody quotes, because the scandal is more fun than the substance. His argument was that Scripture was never trying to be a physics textbook or a court transcript. Its writers spoke in the idioms of their own time to audiences with their own limits. And what the text is fundamentally for, he claimed, is moral. It calls people toward justice and toward loving kindness. Everything else, the cosmology, the chronology, the details that fit their world and not ours, is the vehicle, not the cargo. That's why he thought a book could be composite, edited, humanly transmitted, and still do everything it was ever meant to do. You can push back on that. Plenty of philosophers and theologians have from both directions. But notice what it isn't. It isn't demolition. He spent the second half of that treatise defending the freedom to think and speak precisely because he thought a text like this, read honestly, produces better people rather than worse ones. And under it sits the affirmative core of his whole philosophy, which is where this lands. Spinoza's God isn't a person on a throne making decisions. He identified God with the whole of what exists, nature in its total, necessary order, which is why he thought the highest human activity is understanding, and why he called the deepest form of joy available to a human being the intellectual love of God. Meaning, the more you actually grasp of how things truly are, the more you participate in the divine. Understanding isn't a threat to reverence in that system. Understanding is the form reverence takes. The final line of his Ethics says, in the Standard English translation, that blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. It doesn't come later, as payment. It's what living clearly feels like from the inside, right now. Bring that back to the Torah and something shifts. The version you were taught gave you one voice, dictated, sealed, perfect, and slightly inert. What the evidence gives you instead is louder and far more alive. Someone in the northern hills telling stories about Jacob. Someone in Jerusalem counting the days of creation with the precision of a liturgist. A poet whose Hebrew is so old that scholars can date it by its grammar. Refugees carrying scrolls south from a burning kingdom. An editor in exile, holding two irreconcilable accounts of the flood, deciding that both belong to his people. A woman in Jerusalem around 600 BCE wearing a blessing hammered into silver against her skin. That's not less sacred. It's 1,000 years of human beings reaching for something with everything they had and refusing to let the reaching be lost. And the questions that brought you here. The ones that maybe first showed up at 15 in a youth group room with folding chairs when you noticed something didn't add up and were told not to lean on your own understanding. Those questions were your mind working exactly as it should. They didn't take anything from you. They walked you into a bigger room. If that reframe is worth something to you, pass it to somebody still standing outside the door. One last thing about what this actually changes, because there's a fear underneath this subject that deserves to be said plainly rather than tiptoed around. The fear is that if the Torah has many authors, it has no authority, that the whole thing collapses into just literature. But look at what actually happened historically. Jews have been reading this text as composite, layered, and argued over for a very long time. The entire rabbinic tradition is built on treating every wrinkle in the text as an invitation to interpret rather than an embarrassment to hide. Christians across the theological spectrum, including plenty who hold the text as authoritative, have absorbed multiple authorship and kept right on reading. The tradition didn't shatter. It got a longer memory of itself. What actually dies is one particular claim about the mechanics of production. That's it. And that claim, as we saw, was already being poked at by Ibn Ezra in the 1100s, inside the tradition, by a man whose commentary is still printed in the margins of the page. What you gain is worth more than what you set down. You gain the ability to read a text without needing it to be something it never said it was. You gain a 1,000-year conversation instead of a monologue. You gain the freedom to sit with a passage that troubles you and ask which voice is speaking here and what world they were speaking into, which is a far better question than pretending you're not troubled. And you gain the habit itself, which travels. The willingness to ask who wrote this, when, for whom, and what got changed on the way to me. That's not corrosive. That's how a person stays free in a world absolutely full of confident simplifications about everything, not just religion. Spinoza's wager, 350-some years ago, was that honesty and reverence are not opposites. That looking straight at a thing is a way of loving it. You don't have to agree with his metaphysics to test that wager against your own experience of the last 20-some minutes. Something got clearer. Nothing got smaller. So here's what I'd genuinely like to know, down in the comments. What was the first verse or the first detail that made you stop and think, wait, that doesn't fit? Not the argument you eventually landed on. The moment. The specific line, in the specific room, at the specific age. Those stories are almost always more interesting than any conclusion, and the people reading them tend to recognize themselves. If you got something out of this, subscribing and liking is what tells the algorithm that careful, slow investigations still have an audience. And there's a great deal more of this trail left to walk. The Josiah scroll deserves its own hour. So does the Septuagint. So does the question of what happened to these texts once they crossed into Greek. The Torah wasn't written the way you were taught. It was written the way real things are written by real people over real time. Which means the story of how you got that book is, itself, one of the oldest stories it has to tell.